happy to have this session today on a very serious topic. As you know, the name of our program, title of our program is Trauma, Semantic Reactions, Reflections, Retentions. And this is a panel discussion, and let me read a little bit from the introduction to this program. General semantics is concerned with how events translate to perceptions, how they are further modified by the names and labels we apply to them, and how we might gain a measure of control over our own responses, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral. Okay, so this is a topic that is very much of concern and very relevant to the discipline of general semantics. Trauma can be defined as an event that is experienced as deeply disturbing and distressing, and typically we distinguish between psychological trauma and physical trauma involving some kind of bodily injury, wound, or harm. But they're not totally separate. Psychological trauma can lead to somatic effects. Physical trauma is often accompanied by psychological trauma. But our focus, of course, is on psychological trauma. And questions like how can we better understand the experience of trauma? What are the roles played by perception, language, and memory in our experience of traumatic events and their after effects? How is trauma recognized and repressed? What are the therapeutic approaches to coping with trauma? Is it possible for us as human beings to prepare ourselves for the possibilities of traumatic encounters? It seems that the topic is probably always timely in one sense, and yet it is impossible to ignore the fact that we just have seen on the news the events down in Florida, at Parkland High School, and the renewed talk about the experience of trauma for the students there, as well as, and I was very moved by one journalist on MSNBC saying, instead, where they ought to be and would normally be dealing with the trauma, the students there are instead going out and speaking out. And we certainly applaud them for doing so. So there's so much that we can take up, and I'm so happy to have our panelists with us. Let me introduce them to you. On my left is Laurie Ramos. She earned her PhD in media ecology from New York University, and her early research and scholarship explored the role of media in shaping conceptions and attitudes towards literacy. But more recently, her interests in communication have evolved to include psychotherapy and the impact of trauma. She received an MSW from Fordham University, with a focus on clinical social work, and also completed EMDR training for trauma therapy. She's currently an assistant professor of media studies at William Patterson University in New Jersey, and a staff therapist at Blanton Peel Institute and Counseling Center in New York. To her left, Michelle S. Cramison. What does the S stand for? What? Suzanne, okay. Michelle Suzanne Cramison has her MA in literature with a concentration in war literature and trauma theory from the State University of New York at New Paltz. Currently based out of New York City, she teaches college writing and research courses, including a course this semester on zombies and trauma. And that's at Fairleigh Dickinson University in New Jersey. Her essay, Confronting Trauma in the Zombie Apocalypse, Witnessing Survivor Guilt and Post-Memory, was recently published in an anthology on media studies, and she has presented on trauma, war literature, and media studies at conferences around the country. And to her left, Matthew Butler, enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1994, was assigned as a combat correspondent and attended the Defense Information School studying basic journalism, photojournalism, and military PR. He is a combat vet with deployments in Fallujah, Iraq, Helmand Province, Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, and South America. Matt's decorations include 2 meritorious. Now I got into service medals, Joint Commendation Medal, 3 Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medals, and 2 Humanitarian Assistance Medals for response to humanitarian crises in Djibouti and Kenya on 2 separate occasions. After retiring from the Marines in 2014, he completed his undergraduate degree in organizational leadership at Fordham and is now the Director of Military and Veteran Services at Fordham University, where he assists service members and veterans with transitioning from the military to higher ed, supports academic integration, career preparation and planning, health and wellness support, and connecting veterans with mentors, both student veteran mentors and corporate partners. Matt has hosted panels about PTSD and moral injuries and continues to be a strong advocate for veterans. He works closely with New York City's Department of Veteran Services and is executive member of Veterans on Campus New York City, and that aids veterans making transitions to colleges and universities in New York. So we're here to talk about this, and really I want to just start off by letting us hear from the panelists and telling us a little bit about their understanding of trauma and their work in that area. So I'll turn it over to
First of all, I'm the literature connection. I love the idea. I've always been interested in reading literature, particularly about trauma. And before I even became involved in this, I like reading about Holocaust literature, that kind of thing, and I enjoy you a lot. Yeah, so I mean, when my personal interest came up, and I was thinking but in terms of my interests in trauma, it's interesting. It's very much connected to language and communication, because I came out of I have my PhD in ecology and ecology, and I studied language, and my early research was on literacy. You know, I went through an illness for a time and was impacted by it personally, and I realized how much the language I had about what I was going through personally really affected how I framed what was going on with me, and how I eventually got myself out of it, with a lot of help and support. And so that's what sort of moved me, I thought was going to move me out of communication and into clinical social work, right? Was this personal trauma of having been ill and deciding I needed to do something different with my life. I needed to, I had a crisis of sorts, and figuring out how I was going to have the rest of my life be after this. And so I went back and got a degree in social work to help others, and that's when I realized that my interest was all along really in still communication, language, and how what we say, how we think about events, and then describe those events to us, what happened to us, how that very much affects the outcome of how we feel. Right? So that's briefly working with them to reframe that really can have a shift in how they feel from that trauma. So that's sort of my personal journey.
So, totally different. What sparked my interest in trauma was literature. And the first book that really hooked me was Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. And when I first approached that book, and it was about, the first pages, I'm planning a party. And I'm like, how is this part of war literature? I'm not understanding the correlation. And then as I read it, and I saw the parallel story of Septimus Smith, who was a shell-shocked World War I soldier, I gravitated towards his half of the story. And when he decides, spoiler alert, to take his own life, I wanted, versus getting the psychiatric treatment that they were forcing upon him, I wanted to know, how bad could it be? And so I went from there and I looked at the treatments of World War I, and I went into Dr. Rivers. And so if you don't know Dr. Rivers, he was the premier doctor of the time of expression over repression. So at the time, it was repress your thoughts, get some electroshock therapy, take 3 days off, go back onto the, into the trenches. And so from there, I really looked at all of Dr. Rivers' treatments. And what he wanted to do was how do we describe, how do we create a vocabulary, a language for the unthinkable, especially at World War I with trench warfare and shells. This was all new technology. None of these men were kind of forced into going to be a soldier. Otherwise, they were a coward, and there could be nothing worse at the time. And so I'm speaking from Great Britain's point of view, by the way, Sally. And so I looked at Dr. Rivers, who was based out of Craig Lockhart Hospital in Scotland. And it was really groundbreaking at the time. And everyone was pretty much against his expression over repression. They were pushing to get the electroshock therapy and get the soldiers out. Meanwhile, he was trying to figure out, how do we create a new language for something that doesn't exist? How do we describe being shelled into the air and landing into a German soldier's open abdomen, which was a true story out of his findings and research? And how do we move on from those instances? Because the physical trauma leads to the psychological trauma, and it can go the other way around. And so from there, my studies took me into World War II Holocaust. And I started looking at the transference of trauma, because Dr. Rivers, there were studies that showed that he himself had started to absorb all the soldiers' traumas from listening. And while it was a great cure for them, he seemed to take on all this trauma, even though he wasn't there. He wasn't in the trenches. He was strictly a doctor to help soldiers. So I was interested in looking at that transfer. And then I moved to the Holocaust. And one of the things that I argued was that third generation survivors of the Holocaust, that would be the grandchildren of the survivors, are inheriting that trauma. And so at first I remember when I brought up this idea to my thesis mentor, she was like, no, that's crazy. And so maybe you think I'm crazy, so I'll explain it. On the 10-year anniversary of 9/11, which we can all say we're in New York City, if you were here at the time, we remember what happened, right? That's the episodic memory in our head, the psychology perspective. I can tell you exactly where I was, and maybe you can remember where you were. And so right there, we know that this is a trauma instilled in all of us, even if we weren't a part of it, if we weren't affected, if we didn't know anyone who died. This happened so locally. And so one of the things that I look at is the temporal distance from the trauma, the time. That's the third generation survivors from the Holocaust. The local, the physical distance, for us, we would be really local. So on the 10-year anniversary, the commemoration, someone, they have people come up and say names, and they get to say little snippets. And there was a boy about 10 years old, and he said, "Daddy, I love you. I wish I could have met you, but I was in mommy's belly." So he never met his father, who died in 9/11, in the 9/11 attacks. But can we claim that he isn't traumatized to mourn someone he never met? We can't. He's absolutely traumatized, right? And so I looked at that transference, and for Holocaust specifically, for the third generation, I looked at this idea of the erasure of history, that for third generation, they don't know their roots anymore because their family either perished, they had very few relatives that survived, absolutely no sentimental items that they could cling on to. So I looked at that idea of how we are traumatized and how we can inherit that trauma. And then I connected it back to Rivers, that it's not that we're trying to unearth these scars to feel this pain over and over again, but that as survivors of this trauma, we have the goal. We need to relive it for other people who don't know it. So we need to awaken this trauma. We need to create a language for people who don't have a voice, or like in World War I, we're way too scared to say anything and be labeled a coward. So I really looked at that as it's our job right now to awaken that trauma, to represent that trauma, to give a voice to kind of silent or invisible soldiers or people who never got to speak because they died unwillingly. So that's right.
So to start with the literature piece, because that's kind of the theme, I guess, where we start. I'm certainly late to higher education, and I read the Iliad and the Odyssey for the first time, and after I retired from the Marine Corps, and without any prompts, I connected with the story, the trauma that is so apparent in the text, and related to it in a way that a warrior would in this long epic journey of trying to get back home after conflict, after experiencing trauma in whole and in part, in pieces. And that ultimately took me back to when I joined the Marine Corps, and how the Marine Corps took me and transformed me into a Marine. They trained me how to be a Marine, how to fight battles and win wars, to be a basic rifleman. And all those things that I've learned in boot camp were all meant to prepare me for ultimately what I would experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some 10 years after I enlisted in the Marine Corps. With that training, though, they train you how to react to traumatic experiences, how to handle them, how to deal with them. But there wasn't a lot of training on how to deal with it after the fact. I saw from 94 a very different approach to some people that were perceived to have a weakness if they had PTSD or some reaction to trauma, that was seen as a weakness, to go from, well, it became a very a topic of great deal of discussion because it affected our ability to function. It was an issue that affected readiness and our ability to fight and win battles, which is exactly what we're asked to do. So seeing how we took a different approach, that trauma experienced in combat is more like a broken leg than it is a weakness, something that when you have a traumatic experience in combat, it's like being branded in a way that creates scars and are things that you have to heal from. It's something that you have to talk through, and ultimately, we wouldn't talk about trauma. We wouldn't talk about these mental weaknesses to a point where, hey, let's get around the table and let's talk about how we deal with our loss, this experience, and those types of things, to develop where we actively help the reintegration of troops coming back from combat and having more resources and support in a way that helps veterans deal with those experiences. And certainly, higher education has been a great place for many veterans to make a transition, because like in in the Odyssey, once you go off to war, it's about the journey of getting back to some place that is normal, your home, something that you're familiar with. And certainly, as we know, things are always changing, so you'll never be able to find the home that you left. And I think that's something that we learned in general semantics, is this, things are ever evolving, and people will say, hey, that veteran, he came back and he's so much different. But in a lot of ways, we're all different. If you go away for a year and you haven't seen your loved ones, they will certainly be around their other family members, and you're the oddball out. You come back, and everybody has changed, but you seem to have the most change. And certainly that's true. You go through a traumatic experience, or just the fact that it's like going to another planet. When you go to Iraq and Afghanistan, that it's you separate yourself from everything that you're used to and feel familiar with, and coming back home, that's a tough transition. So certainly having to deal with the trauma that you have in combat, but also the family members then have to deal with this reintegration process, which is traumatic in itself. So certainly evolving the language that we use to help that integration, to identify really what is PTS. I kind of like to call it PTS because a reaction to a traumatic experience is a natural response in so many ways that how can it be a disorder? It's an instinctive thing that that helps us stay alive. If we experience we touch something hot, we know not to touch it again. Kind of reaction. So how can learning something like that be a disorder? But it certainly it goes on to cause so many different things that then it has to be treated as a disorder. You separate yourself from your friends and family. You don't feel like your friends and family get you because of the experience that you had, and that causes distance to where you withdraw. I mean, these are the symptoms that have to be treated with EMDR and other very successful treatments.
Well, I think there's some really great themes that are coming out of this. I would just like to throw out to you, just to put a little general semantics into it, that we are talking about two types of trauma, not just in the physical and psychological, but there is trauma as events that happens, and trauma as experience, and that's where the semantic reaction comes in, how the individual experiences it, makes sense of it, and how that continues to be a part of who we are and our psychological makeup. And so in general semantics, we talk about the difference between a signal reaction, which is knee-jerk, a reflex reaction, something happens when we jump off, as opposed to a symbol reaction where we reflect, we think about things, we delay and think things over. And we also talk about the difference between being intentional and extensional. Intentional, not in the normal sense of it, it's spelled with an S instead of a T, but meaning looking only at your own subjective view. Extensional, which is what general semantics recommends, is to look at it objectively, to not let your feelings overwhelm you, or not let your subjective views overwhelm you. I was wondering how you might relate that to what you brought up here.
So, you said a lot. So I'll have to.
Any part of it.
I'll have to sort of work from what you said last, because I think.
Sure.
So I'll take when I'm working with a client as a therapist, right? So an event happens, and it's interesting because different people respond differently to different events, right? Someone could go through something, sort of somewhat similar situation and respond very differently. And I think part of that is how they make meaning. I think that's a big part of it. How they understand it, and how language is I'm sort of drawn to what you were both talking about, in literature with the Odyssey, because metaphor comes up so often in when I'm talking to clients about their experiences, because they'll say it's kind of like this, or it's technically a simile, right? It's kind of like this, and then right, they'll give me a metaphor, and I'll say, let's explore that. Let's see what that means to you. Let's try to understand it, because I've seen it. If one, in my own personal experience, that's sort of what led me to pursue this work on my own. If I can understand the meaning that I made and the metaphor I had about it, and what it meant to me, how I understood myself as a result of that event, that can change. That's what I find literature so appealing, and that's why clients also will bring in all the time literature that they've read that has affected them so profoundly, or a movie that re-triggers or in the media. I actually, with this most recent shooting, I had a client who had two, friends shot on a college campus, a decade ago in an isolated incident. And so, of course, all of this comes up again, right? And how she reacts to this, and what this means to her, and how she copes with it, and so we just need a way to express it, expressing as opposed to repressing. We need a way to express how we've come to understand it, and understand that is a subjective interpretation, right? As much as it is our real experience, our true experience, it's a subjective perception of that experience, right? It's how you came to understand it, and that nothing is wrong with that. It's not like there's a right way you should have come through it, right, or thought about it. But understanding how you did is key to kind of move through it and try on all different hats, alternative ways of thinking about it, different paradigms.
Kind of being objective about your own subjectivity.
Yeah, right, exactly. So that's sort of how I would answer your question. From my own experiences, why that? Why that interpretation? How else might you interpret it? How,
Yeah.
So when you mentioned experiences, that goes right back to my third generation trauma transference and how we take those experiences and what we do with them. And so, a little quickie, right? The first generation are literally the Holocaust survivors. Then there's the 1.5 generation. Those are the people who enter the Holocaust as children. So they don't really have much of a pre-war experience. Their pre-war was a few years of vague childhood memories, and then the Holocaust was their childhood. Then there's the second generation, which are the children. And so for subjectivity, there's a few different ways to look at it. One of them is Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which is a very famous graphic novel. And so he is growing up in Queens. Yeah, Queens?
Yeah.
Queens, Rego Park. Okay.
Everybody.
Yeah, everyone goes to Queens.
All right.
So he's in Queens. His father and his mother immigrated over to America after the war, and he is absorbing his father's nuances and things like, how could you hang up my coat on a wire hanger? Also irrationally hoarding food, which is a huge thing that a lot of survivors did. So their children grew up with these nuances, almost were annoyed by them because they couldn't understand that trauma. Versus second generation, there's a well-known author, Eva Hoffman. She was born in 1940s post-war Poland. So Art Spiegelman's experience was pretty negative. He was very stressed out over his father's nuances. His mother committed suicide. His father remarried another Holocaust survivor. That wasn't a very happy marriage either. First, Eva Hoffman, who grew up in the destruction, right? Both her parents were Holocaust survivors. And she mentions having a very wonderful life, growing up in the destruction, being a part of a community of survivors who decided not to leave and to rebuild. So they almost moved beyond the trauma versus Art Spiegelman's father, Butler, who could never escape it, part of that repression. I'll just move to America, not for a better life, but to get away from my war life. And so we see these different responses. You would think being born into post-World War Poland, World War II Poland, horrific. The cities were still in shambles, and she writes about that. The city was still in destruction where she lived. And she mentions, when she talks about trauma, that she thinks trauma is really just an excess of what the psyche can handle. That we've hit our limit, and after that limit, that's our trauma. And so she looks at this idea of, I've had this beautiful community of survivors around me, and then I can move forward. So just looking at the experience of the second generation, which is more immediate to the experience, and yet they enjoy it. She gets back there. Oh, or you can just unplug it. There we go. Thank you. And so the experience, it's the experience of that. And then I wanted to go to what you said, because the other issue is this idea of reconciling pre-war self with post-war. I like the post-traumatic stress, this idea of not disorder, stress. How do we reconcile those? And then how do we, as civilians, how do we not negate their experiences? How do we not downplay? Because that's the thing, just move on, right? And I can't imagine someone saying that, but have you experienced that? Just move on? I can't imagine.
Well, yeah, not so much, no. I can't think of it.
But in World War I, that was a big thing. Like, get over it. Don't be weak. Don't be a coward. And so this idea also from the point of view of the civilian versus the person who experienced it, how do we reconcile those ideas? How do we reconcile those now two lives? And how do we take that experience and move on from it?
So we talk about war in metaphors in a lot of ways. We say war is hell, and it certainly is hell. But I know veterans, including myself, where after I left that environment, there were times that I wanted to go back because it's a place where you have this amazing bond with individuals that are willing to give their life. I mean, that's powerful. And the thing that will often be said about combat is you're fighting for the man to the left and right, to the soldier, Marine to the left and right. That becomes your focus. War is a very complex thing, particularly this war that I experienced from every aspect, from the terrain to the politics to the language barriers to the complexities of how we're fighting this war and how our enemy is conducting from IEDs to just not having a clear enemy, wearing a uniform, having the symbols of what you would think, what we've come to know what we knew before this war about how war was fought, how war was won. Parade issue has been a topic in recent times, and it's not hard to think about a 1946 ticker tape parade down Fifth Avenue after the successful conclusion of World War II that saw a clear victory, or what we thought was a victory. And it's certainly hard to put a finger on what success we've had in this war. And certainly it doesn't feel like the end of the game, we've won something and we can all be very happy and then have a parade about it. But that says something a little bit more about our culture and how we, back to this idea of how culture informs us about these things. We're not a warrior culture today. We, in this war, for the most part, we can still go and do all the things that we have the great opportunity in this great country to partake in, all the freedoms. And there's little effort that we have to put into thinking about what the consequences of a war, a prolonged war on terrorism, is all about. It's interesting, in Sebastian Junger's book, Tribe, they talk about how in a warrior culture like a Native American culture, there was certainly conflict, but there wasn't this idea of stress or trauma from conflict, because at the end of the day, or at least the warriors didn't experience the after effects, PTSD, if you will, because they came back to their community accepted them, they spoke a language that they understood, that they related to, because they weren't going away from their homes for years at a time. They were going the distance that they could carry themselves on their foot or on their horses, and then come back to their communities. So there was a language that there was a support network. There was an understanding about what trauma is all about, and I think that's one thing that we lack in this war. The statistics are about 12% of combat or of veterans or of service members actually see combat, gunfire, IEDs, etc. But there's a much higher percentage of folks being diagnosed with PTS because of what I think is this biomagnification of stressors that come from an experience, a year-long, a 7-month deployment where you may not see actual combat, have a traumatic experience, but you'll see what they at a base or station, or a base like Camp Leatherneck, when a soldier, a Marine dies, they have a dignified transfer. So everybody lines up on the flight line. They bring out a casket draped in a flag and put it on a C-130, fly that angel back to Dover. It doesn't take many times going to a flight line in the course of your daily mission for those things to kind of add up to a traumatic experience. One thing about the military is that we use language that bypasses some truths about things. For example, KIA, that's killed in action. EKIA, enemy killed in action. And certainly the military is known for acronyms. We use them, and it becomes a different language that we speak amongst ourselves. We don't call a rifle, we call an M16 and M14. We have all of these acronyms that bypass the actual thing. And I think in some part that's meant to expedite communication, because it would take too long to say these things in a compact, stressful situation. But at the same time, it does a lot to put distance between an actual event. A tick, troops in combat. You can hear a tick that's happening that might send the hair on the back of your neck up because you know that people are engaged in life or death situations. So, but it makes it all manageable at the same time, and that's the interesting thing I think about military language in that aspect is it helps us go through some of these very stressful events and being able to manage them. But we don't have that same language on the backside so much, and maybe that's something to investigate a little bit more about how to deal. We don't use a lot of acronyms helping people with PTS, for example. Speed up the process.
Well, euphemism, certainly, I mean, the famous ones from long ago was engaging the enemy on all sides for being surrounded, and controlled flight into terrain for a crash landing. But I mean, that is a way to control semantic reactions or try to manipulate them. And this is, we've had euphemism, metaphor come up, and narrative to begin with. And you're all in your own way writers as well. So it makes me wonder, I mean, what is the role of not just reading, but writing in this? How can writing help? How do you use writing to try to think about this and to try to encourage others to do so? I know that's you.
Where to begin with that, right? Because when I was working on my dissertation, I was working with young people who were basically deemed non-writers, illiterate, and I was interested in, and they were in classes to sort of help them learn how to write, and I discovered that they were writing quite a bit. They wrote a lot. They just weren't writing. They weren't sort of conforming to what was understood as academic writing and the norms of academic writing, right? But they were, a long time ago, so they were rapping, right? Writing poetry and letters. They actually were writing letters. I still have some of the samples that they feed back to not emails, but so I thought this was really curious, right? Because they are literate, right? But we're saying they're illiterate. We're saying they're not literate, right? So I wanted to investigate how they saw themselves, and they did see themselves as writers. Actually, they didn't see this thing called school writing as particularly valuable or pertinent to them understanding their world, because they were so involved in their world about their social and personal experience. But in fact, quite a lot of it was understanding the sort of maybe traumas with a small t and sometimes with a large t that they were going through as adolescents, right? And they were using writing to navigate that. So, flash forward now, I will often say to clients, have you thought about journaling about what you're going through and how you understand it? For example, I had this one client who her sort of default mode is guilt. She sort of feels guilty a lot about a lot of things. And I said, well, I give them little books. I kind of buy these cheap books and give them little books. And I say, if something comes up that's upsetting to you or distressing to you, and you want, why don't you jot it down and how you feel about it and how you understand it, what words come And some of this is also comes up in cognitive behavioral therapy, right, where you sort of identify how what's the event, what happens, and your belief about what happens, and how you feel about what happens, and sort of maybe take that negative belief you have, like, oh, I'm so stupid. I have a client that say, I'm just so stupid. Of course, this, it's my fault. So these default kind of modes that people go to it's semantics, right? So much language about how they've come to define who they are, right? I am stupid, right? So that's really just right there, like, if you understand who you are essentially as stupid, what are your options? Who else might, So I sort of have them take these notes and write these things down, or like with the person who was feeling guilt so much, jot down keep a guilt diary, like how often you feel guilty and what comes up and why, what were the circumstances around that particular moment when you felt guilty, and then we sort of look at it, and the language that they use to write about it helps us reconsider an alternative paradigm, or how else, they might want to think about that particular feeling.
I think memoir exists, therefore that is proof that writing is therapeutic to reconcile with our trauma. It's memoirs everywhere. And one of the reasons why, and there's a writer, Dorothy Allison, very famous writer, and she wrote a small preface to one of her books called Deciding to Live. And she was a victim of sexual assault her whole life as a child until she was a teenager at the lead. She was marginalized for her sexuality as a lesbian in the 60s. And so she mentions how she would bring yellow legal pads everywhere she would go and write all over napkins, and then she would throw it away. And eventually she decided she needed to publish this because by putting it into writing, it then solidifies the memory of what happens and then gives you a chance to understand it. Because trauma will repeat itself mentally. So if the physical trauma happened once, it will just come back. Whether or not you wanted to, you can't fight it off. And it unwillingly comes back. And you'll see that you mentioned scars. And that's a huge theme of this idea of trauma as a scar. Even if you weren't physically scarred, you're mentally scarred. So by putting it into writing, you're solidifying it. You're proving it happened to you. And then you're giving yourself a chance to translate it, to figure out, what can I do with this trauma? How can I cope it? How can I move on forward from it? Because that's the thing. If we let the trauma keep us down, we don't move, right? We can't do anything. That's where we get lonely. We pull ourselves away from our friends and family. And so we need to write. It's proven. You need to write. Even if I'm so dumb, I feel so guilty. If you don't put it down, you can't reconcile with those emotions that you can't avoid from that trauma no matter what happens to you. Because Dorothy Allison blamed herself for her sexual abuse from her stepfather, raping her as a child. She blamed herself, and she didn't know how to deal with it until she said, I took that yellow legal pad everywhere I went until I put it onto the paper and stopped throwing it away. So we have to write. And it doesn't matter the quality of writing. And you can just read, and that was actually Art Spiegelman's Mouth. If you haven't read it, please read it. And it took him 13 years to write the whole story. And he kind of said it was a death of himself, but also a death of that anger towards his father for being the way he was. For now, he can understand his father's Holocaust trauma and why he was this sort of miserable person. And so it took him 13 years. But through writing that's when he was able to reconcile that anger with his father, the trauma that his father had, the trauma that he then inherited from his father, even though he was born, and raised in Queens, very separated from the actual destruction of the countries the country that his father was from. So yeah, writing is crucial in trying to cope and understand your own trauma.
Can I actually say something? You know, it also brings back the value of objectifying. It does make it an object that is less subjective than sort of what runs, we all do it, what goes around in our heads, right? Like if you just keep letting it go in your head, it can really get, But if you objectify it and put it out there, you sort of begin to separate, well, what's actually fact? That I was raped by my father at 10 or whatever, right? Versus the feelings around what happened at that event, right? So you can start to use language in a way to separate the objective from the subjective and look at it and talk about it that way. I think it's really helpful.
In that respect, the phrase from Eric Havelock comes to mind. Havelock studied ancient Greece. He was a classicist from the Iliad and the Odyssey to Plato, and he talks about effective writing was to separate the knower from the known, right? That you can put it outside of yourself and look at it from the outside. But
so one of the great things that's come about is veteran writing workshops. Fordham has one that's 10 years old that has literally thousands of stories, and there are about 40 anthologies from this veteran writing workshop that is done by David Surface. And I would, if I could put a plug, if you want to see more information about the veteran writing workshop, you can find us on Instagram at RamVets on Instagram. There's a story there about our veteran writing workshop, but NYU has one, we have one at Fordham, Columbia has one, and there are many communities that have their own veteran writing workshops, and we know it works because the veterans tell us it works. It might be the thing that gives them a sense of normalcy, that helps them put them back on the course, that road home, if you will. We also started an art workshop for veterans, so ways to express that trauma and talk about it in many different forms, medias, and symbols that helps orient that experience. And we had a Vietnam veteran in our class that had some real trouble for many, many years, and it wasn't until he experienced a writing workshop that gave him some of the relief that he so direly needed in his circumstances. That stories like that are inspiring. It gives the veteran an opportunity to, again, put that experience into words, and it helps them go through the process of writing it, remembering it, cataloging it, the time-binding aspect of sharing that with other people is a great reward. At the end of each writing workshop, we bring all the veterans together, and then they read their stories in front of their friends and family, and that certainly is a wonderful experience and part of the process and the good work that happens through a veteran writing workshop.
that is great. I know that some of you want to ask questions, so we'll have plenty of time for that. I want to go through a few more topics to throw out to our panel. One of them is that, and I was actually going to ask about sexual abuse, because that hadn't come up, but Michelle, you brought that up. And so, we're talking about trauma as a kind of abstract category. Is it all the same, all basically the same, or are there many kinds of traumas that need to be considered individually? And along with that is perhaps that we talk about collective trauma. Is there such a thing as collective trauma, or is there only individual trauma? Yeah, we don't have to go in.
Please. So you reminded me that I never finished my thought on deciding to live from Dorothy Allison. So she was writing, and through her writing, because she was suicidal, the writing helped her to decide to live, that she could work through this trauma. So, of course, there's all different traumas. There's the psychological, right? There's the physical, we know that, but the collective one we haven't talked about. And I think there's no doubt there is a collective trauma, especially as I open. We're in New York, and if you're from this area, the collective trauma of 9/11 and how and after all these big events, at least for my generation, I don't know. For me, it was, I guess, the JFK assassination. Would you say you knew exactly where you were and how that went? No? A little too young? Okay. Maybe, okay, in the back I see some people. Maybe that. So for me, 9/11 of my generation, at least it was. And coming together afterwards, that was a feeling you can't really replicate. And it wasn't because, we're united. It was that a little bit. But it was because we were all feeling the pain of that day. We all felt it. And I think we see it now, even at Parkland, the collective trauma of that community. And here we can see again that kind of physical distance. How traumatized am I from that scenario? Not as much. Did I know anyone? No. But can I relate because of the collective trauma I felt from previous events? Absolutely. Right? So we look at that idea of what do we do with collective trauma? We have to talk, right? We have to have workshops. I'm sure the guidance counselors down at the school are doing something to have open communication, because that's the thing. If we don't communicate with one another about what we're feeling, whether it is that call to action from those students who are saying we need to change the laws, or just expressing sadness over someone you lost, that's our collective trauma. Or maybe you didn't lose anyone. Maybe you were running from the school, but you still saw blood splatters. That's enough, right? So, and they're young, right? They're 14 to 18. That's a lot to handle. So that collective trauma is a way to handle something that maybe your brain, you haven't really developed how to cope with those type of emotions. So collective trauma is definitely something that's true and present.
Even if there are experiences like 9/11 where maybe we all have went through at the same moment, right? Or there's something like sexual abuse and assault, right? Where we may not have all experienced it at the same moment, but there are enough people who have had some similar experiences that if they can share their stories, right? If they can share their stories of those experiences, they gain strength and they gain perspective, right? It's very powerful, and I've seen that. People, for example, with, as you talked about Dorothy Allison, and shame is so common it's shocking sometimes to me how when others who have been sexually abused hear the shame from someone else, like when the whole #MeToo movement happened and people got to read other people's stories of that, right? They brought that into my office and they were talking about how incredibly valuable that was to hear the language of other people sharing their experience of having been through something. It wasn't exactly like what they went through, but it was close enough that it helped them feel less alone in their experience, but it also helps them make sense of their feelings. Like, oh, shame, that's not unique to me. Maybe it's not because I did something wrong. Maybe it's something that people collectively experience as a result of that kind of trauma.
So one of the things that is a serious, very serious and unfortunate thing about the war is that sexual trauma for women veterans particularly that has happened and covered up and not reported because of reasons that you discussed about the shame that comes along with something very traumatic. But in the same way that we would hold memorial services where you have the M16 in the ground with the helmet on top signifying someone that died from the unit, we don't have any kind of symbolic service or something that is an equally traumatic experience. Like, we don't have these kinds of reactions to when we learn that one of our own was abused by a fellow soldier or Marine, because there's this trust that is supposed to be, that makes up the military. When that trust is broken, it's very grievous. It's a mark on us, and we don't treat those kinds of traumas in the same way. But the work to try to make those things right is certainly difficult, but it's something that doesn't get as much airtime, if you will, as it should, because that's
Well, I guess, along the lines of different types of traumas, Laurie, I know you mentioned trauma with a small t. Is it possible that the word becomes overused at sometimes, that too overgeneralized? And I'm wondering, for example, that there's in psychology there's like one line of thinking that everyone's traumatized, and that birth is a trauma, and that other experiences in early childhood are traumatic as well. I mean, if you're go through kind of the typical childhood dynamics, get picked on at some point, that, or even, taking Freud, toilet training is traumatic. Is that a misuse of the term? Do we use it too much?
How do you feel about PTSD?
Well, yeah, I certainly think that because PTSD it is a label that comes with a lot of general beliefs about something like that it is overused, that people that have traumatic brain injuries exhibit similar symptoms of somebody that has had trauma. That's trauma to the brain. Of course, it's a physical thing, but so I do think it's overused. It certainly paints the veteran as damaged, and as we talked about, PTSD is something that you can recuperate from. It's not you have PTSD for life. You can learn to adapt and deal with the trauma that you experience. So it certainly, I talk to many people that when I tell them I work with veterans, it's like, wow, they really need all the help you could give them, and they certainly do. But that doesn't tell the whole story, that such a small percentage of the veterans that I deal with, it's kind of the 90% 10% or less require a lot of the time and attention to help them through that. But there are so many veterans that have gone through traumatic experiences or have gone through difficult times that have been able to go through things and come out on the other side without the stigma of PTSD. So yes, I think, for example, in that case, PTSD is overused in all things.
So I don't think I can, judge someone's trauma. Unless we're saying, like, how can I say, like, that's not traumatic? I think PTSD, the term, is just way overused in the fact that we use it so much, so quick to label people with it for whatever I feel like I hear it all the time, that we almost lessen the severity of it for people who are really struggling with post-traumatic stress. But we can't really judge someone's trauma, the little t, the big T, what is that little t, potty training, I can't remember it as a child, so I can't say I'm traumatized. Maybe as a parent, it's traumatizing. I don't know, right? So I can't claim that, and I wouldn't say, could you? And then I've heard I have post-traumatic stress disorder from potty training my kids. I hear it downplayed like that, not in exactly those terms, and it lessens the severity of it. So I think the terms get overused. And that's because, again, we don't know how to define what happened to us. We literally need a new language to define. And, how do we put into words how we're feeling besides just saying, I was traumatized? And that's the easiest way to go. So we need a new vocabulary. We need to figure out how to attribute meaning to each of the instances that we have that might affect us, but maybe not traumatize us. But I would never label someone's trauma if they claimed they were traumatized. I would make them write about it, and then we can work through it.
I think it's like the non-Aristotelian approach of we can't know everything about a person and or a thing or an event, that it would be wrong of us to put a label, a perception on someone in a way that limits our ability to interact with them or understand them or for them to interact with us.
Then what you do is if it's your own ego and speaking to yourself.
So that's a great question, because this is a challenge for many veterans in the fact that tough exterior, like I can do this, I don't need help to get through some of the things. And I think that's where the language has changed.
Where would you approach the general semantics?
Yeah, so I think that it's taking the approach that you can't know everything about someone with that has experienced a trauma, that you would have to examine that situation before you could make a judgment. I mean, help me out here. I mean, that's exactly right. I think that's the thing, because when you put a label like PTSD, it already invokes all of these thoughts about someone. Are they dangerous? Are they an alcoholic? Are they a drug addict? Can I trust them? An employer will say, well, what happens if I hire a veteran and then one day on the job they just lose it? Well, these are we're putting, like, those things are very limiting, and it just goes against what is the actual, or what I perceive as the reality of the situation, is that veterans aren't dangerous. That they, for example, if you take indicators of success and what it means to be successful, veterans are in higher education exceeding. They have a higher grade point average than the rest of their peers as a segment. So that that doesn't, you may not know that, and that piece of information that would inform you about how to perceive and approach semantics.
We can open up to questions in a few minutes.
Yeah, I first of all, I want to clarify what I meant by that big T and that little t. So one of the things that I believe, and I see, is that sometimes something will happen in the present, right, that feels traumatic. Somebody, for let's say a woman, somebody, in the subway gets too close to her and brushes up against her, and it feels like a violation. It feels uncomfortable, right? But it's not an overt assault, right? But she'll come in, let's say, to the office and be so upset about it. But it might not have been, if we look at it like the subway was crowded, and it may be that this person got too close, but it felt really traumatic for her, and she might be even what you would say is sort of hysterical about what I'm trying to understand really happened when I take the facts apart, right? So what usually happens is that's because that's a trigger, right, for something that happened before, right, that was much more egregious and traumatic for the person, right? So when I talk about that as like a small thing, and you see that in PTSD or PTS all the time, right? Like I had a young woman from Afghanistan, a graduate student, and being on 125th Street, she was a Columbia student, being on 125th Street in the shopping district felt really scary to her because it was a lot like being in, the sort of marketplace where something could go off, a suicide, bomb, or it, and so that became traumatic for her to walk down 125th Street, So I would say that I personally don't think the term can be overused, because if someone is getting sort of hysterical, it's probably historical. That's sort of my link there. There's something going on here that seems. Why else? Right? Why else? Why? We don't, and it's sort of, we see this in EMDR. People just don't, which is a trauma treatment. People just don't get emotionally distraught for no reason. There's something that's there. It may not be this particular event that really makes sense to us if we look at it, but it's so for me, I can't am I going to in the DS, in the diagnostic manual call it, PTSD sometimes when I'm sort of doing an intake and assessing somebody? Probably not, right? But is there stress? Is there, anxiety? Is there something going on that is traumatic to this person? Yeah, probably. And what is it? So my personal thoughts on that.
I wanted to do one more question for you folks, but first I want to say, and Michelle brought up the Holocaust before. My parents are both Holocaust survivors. I grew up in that milieu, and nobody talked about it. Nobody talked about their experiences, and it is sort of passed down because you live with that. And then when I read Helen Epstein's book, Children of the Holocaust, which really told the stories of the second generation, and it was like, oh my God, things that I thought were strange and peculiar to me were in fact something that these other folks are talking about. So, it's clearly we've talked about communication talking, reading, writing. What else can we say about therapy, about coping, and even about preparing? Because life has trauma. I mean, even if we never have war anymore and we have utopia, we'll still, it is the human condition to have to live through our own mortality and those of others. What can we do? What lessons can we learn about dealing with this? To any or all of you?
So you just brought up Holocaust, and that just reminded me of this concept within trauma called the presence of the absence. Whether it's a literal absence, someone you knew died while there, or a more figurative absence that could be like your family roots, things like that. Recognizing that presence, and I think for me, it's always about recognition, acknowledgement. That's my coping mechanism for trauma, right? Recognition, acknowledgement, confronting, being a witness of this trauma, and like I said, awakening it. Right? We have no more World War I soldiers left to listen to their stories, but we can read their stories. We can read Dr. Rivers' findings. We can really promote expression. We need to get rid of the stigma, because I think we were talking about shame, the stigma of trauma. We have to get rid of it, the stigma of post-traumatic stress. And we need acceptance of trauma. We need, and then you mentioned, hysteria, right? When men are called hysterical, hysteria is a feminine word. It was to call what they called crazy women back in the day, right? We need to get rid of the stigma of hysteria, of cowardice, of being weak. We need to confront, and then we need to be a witness. We need to act as a witness, and we need to keep the memory alive, that presence of the absence, because we feel the absence. We feel them gone, we feel the memory gone, we feel the roots of our family gone. So we kind of need to act as warriors to keep the history alive and get rid of the stigma of trauma. And that's my way of coping. And that's why I continuously read and write about it and talk about it, because it's an invisible voice, right? For people who are no longer here, for people who feel the stigma and don't want to speak out. There's a cloak, right? It's veiled, this idea of trauma. And so we need to get rid of being embarrassed about trauma, and we need to speak about it. And so that's one way.
I certainly agree with you. Seeing the evolution of how the military dealt with these issues is refreshing in the fact that it's socialized. It's not seen as a weakness, but as any aspect of one's fitness. If you go and run 3 miles every day, you get good at running 3 miles every day. If you start talking about these issues in a way that it adds a level of fitness amongst a warrior culture, and certainly that's been one of the great things that I've seen. But also you talked about the stigma. It's that, like, the first step of actually seeking help is very difficult, but certainly very necessary, and that kind of takes the community effort to be a part of that effort in a way that is useful, productive, people to understand how that will help our loved ones, our friends, our families through tough times, and making it socially acceptable in a way that it's, again, just like putting a cast on a broken arm. It's how you heal an injury of this kind. So certainly the stigma and doing away with it, and encouraging people to get help, to recognizing that some people will not seek help on their own, and that certainly encouragement and those types of things, and connecting with the services that actually work. EMDR is great to Headstrong is using that exclusively in their treatment, which is a great program for veterans, which is free for veterans to participate in. For example, there's NYU Langone Family Clinic for veterans where veterans and their families can go and get these issues. So I think that's important to know where people can get these opportunities.
I would say it's true that certainly what I've seen is actually seeking help or coming into an office and saying, I have this issue, I don't know how to handle it, and I need help. It's very hard for all of us, I think, to sort of accept our vulnerability. Because I think we live in this culture that the language is, self-sufficiency and self-reliance, right? We have that history of that whole Horatio Alger, myth, right? So I guess for me, I find it actually, I will say to my clients that I feel like it is a privilege for me to be able to share to hear their story. Because I think if I do nothing else, really, even if I can do EMDR, or I can just hear their story, which is language, right? And, right, you talk about not having, there being absence, right? They're not having it spoken, and suddenly coming into a place where their story can be told, their story can be heard, what they experienced as trauma can be accepted as that and validated as that. But it is so hard. I remember this one woman came because she was hearing voices, she was having auditory hallucinations, and that got in the way of her functioning, right, at work. And so she came because of that. But, that got under control. And then what we sort of talked about was that she was depressed, right? But she did not want to be. She did not want to label that as depression. She did not want to be doing that was not okay with her. And I even said to her, so it was okay when you were having hallucinations and needing medication, that was okay to accept that was going on. But it's not okay to just say, you're depressed. Why is that? Why is that not okay? But it's okay to sort of say that because that's so out of the realm of normal. That's a real problem. I got to get help with that. But I'm depressed. That's not okay. I can't talk about that. That's not real. And I should be able to handle that. I should be able to handle that. I just think it's so important to allow conversations to happen through language. That's how the healing happens, in my view. I don't think it's so much magic as it is, telling stories, sharing stories, having them told in groups with a therapist through literature, practicing expression, writing, right? Having it be validated in the world that your experience exists. And I love what Lance was saying. Like, yeah, we live with this existential reality, right? We're going to die. Mm-hmm. And that's so often not talked about and when you have clients that are aging, and that, it's like, let's talk about that. Or just illness, physical illness, right? Like, how do you feel about that? Isn't that experience you want to give language to? Because I'm sure the thoughts are there, right? So why not objectify them and put them out there?
It's creating a new map.
A semantic, right?
Maybe a map out. this would be a great time to open up to questions and comments. Yeah.
I don't know if anybody saw this, but there's a doctor and a gynecologist named Jen Butler. She's writing a new column in the New York Times. And there's a picture of Romeo with really little blue and white. They were teddy bears. And she wrote about the triplet boys that she had, and one of them died. And she wrote about talking about this and about how the loss never goes away and how hard it is, in this society at least, for people to lose babies. And tonight, I am married to an engineer. You turn the switch on and it goes on. You turn it off and it goes off. And he doesn't have an abiding love for therapy. He's married an LCSW, and he said to me, I think you should come to this, go to this meeting. I said, do you want to come with me? You're the member. He said, nah. I said, you go. And I was delighted to come down, and I'm thinking how useful it's been for me to, the words trauma and PTSD. I've been retired from the LCSW for a few years. I'm writing a musical, World War II musical, and for me, this language is a way to hang my hat on something, to organize feelings. And the reason I mentioned the doctor is that we lost a child, and 39 years later, it is still so difficult, and I'm tired of hearing about, grieving that's not, it is normal, and this is a normative response, and I think the more we can talk about these things and honor PTSD, it's just not, it hasn't been honored, and our independence, feeling that independence in this country it's going to bury us. It is so much healthier, and this doctor said it will never go away, it will never be over. She's in practice, she contributes, she's raising the two other little boys, but you have to honor the fact that this happened, and every year, October 16th is difficult for me. My children know, they always call me. It's something that, thinking in terms of trauma and the lack of help that we got from the hospital, any kind of follow-up that happened at the end of the year, I went and threw a Christmas party to show that I could cope. And that was a shame. I'm realizing later, at a much later age, and to honor the PTSD, that there will always be things that set me off. And for all the women and the men, the women is one thing, but the poor fathers is just, men are supposed to keep it, my husband put everything away and said, just don't look in the closets when I came home from the hospital. And I'm so glad that you organized this. It's made me really think about language, and I think we need to talk much more about this in the public arena, for everything, for war, for veterans, for what's going on with the kids who ICE is. I can't imagine what these families are dealing with. I think they'll have PTSD forever. Imagine just not, hiding in your house and your parents are outside, not daring to come in.
And that's something you can't bury the trauma, which probably 39 years ago they were just like, okay, hush. That never works. And as I said, if you try and bury the trauma, it will come back. It will repeat and repeat. Maybe not the physical act of that trauma will repeat, but it will repeat in your mind. And so the expression, and as you said, I have the honor of hearing your story, having someone listen, appreciate, even if they haven't been through that trauma, right? We can't bury the trauma. We have to always try and express. And we can't do that without getting rid of the shame and the stigma and the fear of the repercussions of this, even if you have no control over that, and the guilt. And so, yeah, we're getting away from repression, but it's still there, right? Even if we're not being told to repress, it's our own inner self telling us to repress for fear of the retribution that comes after that expression.
And I would just say grief. I think grief is so under expressed. I mean, not only grief. I mean, grief is about loss, and so we're. I mean, I would say it's probably the most prevalent reality that we're all experiencing losses, right? Whether they're, our physical, agility, people in our lives that we lose.
Celebrities.
But and also even like sometimes I'll say to clients, have you grieved that child that you lost? Yourself. Because some people have had awful childhoods, like Dorothy Allison, who never really got to be a child. And so maybe that depression that shows up later, that they could say, I have no reason to be depressed, and I don't know why I'm depressed. And it's, but maybe there's really something there that you're grieving that you never got expressed. And I think that's really comes up a lot. So.
Yeah, just real quick. I remember certain days very clearly. May 18, 2010. So these things are significant, and I remember them because it's worth remembering, like a memorial. And I think that's important to remember some of these things and do it often and frequently. I think that there's some help in that. And one thing that happened 73 years ago was the Battle of Iwo Jima, one of the worst battles of World War II. Almost 7,000 Marines died on a very small island in the Pacific. And when the 5th Marines were leaving the island, they took a tour through the graveyard there, and right outside of the graveyard was a tin can that had written, "Don't forget about us, but go and live, the rest of your life and remember." And I think a lot of veterans have this great opportunity that I survived, and now I'll do good things with this opportunity. And I think that in itself is very powerful for other veterans, for other people that have experienced trauma, that there is life left to live, a good life, and then that can be inspiring. But it's also it's anchored to this great loss, and turning it around to do something good with what we are fortunate to have.
Pat, yes. You led up to a theory that it wasn't quite finished, but it's also been touched on in emotional grief and recovery and interim. And I guess I just want some feedback.
Sure.
You made implicit comparisons to between the Second World War on the one hand, Iraq, Iran on the other. I did not serve, but I was part of the Vietnam War era.
Right.
I would put that in the later wars as a group. And the term PTSD didn't exist in the Second World War. And we have an image, truly not, I don't know, I'm a historian, that everyone, including my father, came back, reestablished their lives, and no one suffered. No, I'm bullshitting because I know they.
Yeah, right.
On the one hand. On the other hand, I think it might have been partly true. And I'm wondering if you can address that. The other thing we moved to is that the Second World War, maybe because it was widely supported compared to the later wars, had a healing effect. Had a way of addressing without the name, without you didn't want to stigmatize PTSD because it was the D.
So there have been other names for what is shell shock, right? A soldier's war, right? These other terms. What's that?
Battle fatigue.
Battle fatigue.
Battle fatigue.
Thanks, Kevin. So there were certainly things that soldiers have experienced throughout all the time. I mean, you could say that in Homer, certainly, there was battle fatigue and those things. So I think I'll go back to Sebastian Junger's book that is a sociological look at the warrior culture and how and why things are different today. And I think it's that if you look at World War II, it required a national response where you had to ration things. So the war wasn't just fought on distant shores. It was really a combined effort. Again, we're talking a combined effort. That doesn't mean that everybody served, or had to ration or these things, but in a collective sense, the media, it was in the media, it was spoke about, it was on. You would go to the movies to get the latest update on what was going on the front line. So in that aspect, I think to just compare, during this long war, there was a time when places like CNN and Fox News would see their decline in their audience when there was war reporting. And why would they not report as much on the war? Is because it was affecting the bottom line. Their viewers, that's how through advertising that they sell and the impressions that they have. So I think it's this because of technology, because of how we've conducted this war on, you could say, a scaled back, go back to Donald Rumsfeld, is small forces, special forces going in. It's not on the epic scale of World War II where we were so involved. So I think if you look at Vietnam, for example, it had its own political set of circumstances, its unfavorability that contributed to how we experienced that war as a country as well. And the truth is, we are experiencing the war on terrorism, but we wouldn't, I think, recognize it like the greatest generation, our grandfathers, our parents experienced the war. I think that's the difference, at least in my perception.
I guess, would you, again, I don't know if you were heading towards the theory, but if there was one in there, I'll make it.
Okay.
And you tell me I'm bullshit.
Okay, sure.
That kind of cultural acceptance on the returnal side which included monuments, it included a lot of things you brought up throughout, which is ceremonies. I'm using
It's the language.
I'm using yours.
Yeah, sure.
But the linguistic remembrances. How much of a healing at a societal level? How much healing do you think that's worth?
I think it's worth a lot in the fact that the transition for veterans is going back to a culture that doesn't really understand the complexity of this war. I mean, we can say, okay, we can start at 9/11, but this war that we're in didn't start on 9/11. I was in Africa in 1998. That's when our embassies were bombed in Tanzania and in Nairobi. So this war that we're experiencing has a much different start date in a way. Right. It's different in that aspect. So how does that relate to the veteran? I think that when and I got this a lot when I was in uniform. My last news station was here in New York City, and certainly I was getting out on December 10th. I was on terminal leave. I was leaving the Marine Corps after 8 years, December 10th, 2001, and I certainly re-enlisted because I knew I had to. But I always got thank you for your service, and certainly my response in every time is happy to do it. Like I truly, it was a great privilege to do it. What I would love though is to have the conversation not stop there, and I think a lot of veterans would appreciate a conversation, a dialogue that starts there, and then tell me about your experience. Tell me what it was like for you. And if we did this in our daily lives with so many different people around us, we would have a different situation in this world. And I think that's, if you go back to the origin of why we're here, it's Alfred Krasowski saying after World War I, why are we doing this? Why are we killing each other in a way that just doesn't keep up with the evolution of science and how we've evolved in so many different fields, but on a human level, we can't evolve. And I think it goes back to having this dialogue with one another that breaks down barriers that exist between us. We learn more about one another, and we're likely less, we'll find fewer opportunities to want to hurt or harm each other or love each other in the same way that we appreciate what people's sacrifices are all about, why they did it, why would you join the military when there's so many other opportunities, and then what maybe they had a bad experience. Lots of service members have very bad experiences in the military. Lots of them have both. And I think just having that conversation that starts with thank you for your service, tell me what it was like for you. You will learn more about this war, about this world through that line of questioning. I think that's part of why we're here, right?
Absolutely. Thanks. Do you have a question?
I was, to take it ad absurdum, so you have to grieve. A little old lady from Italy dressed in black who's been grieving for 40 or 50 years. Still exactly where she was 40 or 50 years ago. Then the question becomes, so in our scheme of abstracting, grief is, let's say, for argument's sake, a non-verbal level of abstracting. It's an emotional state. And grieving is not going to solve it. Therefore, what, in terms of our understanding comprehending and abstracting what is the next step. If we have nobody else to write a memoir to give us feedback on, we would have to presume that we have an alter ego in front of us, looking at ourselves that we would speak to and say, I feel like this. What would cause it to speak? Then tell me, what should I do next? And the answer would be,
You don't always need an audience for your trauma necessarily. Just because, and so just for the
no grieving and no writing literature. What would you do?
Well, if you're not grieving and if you're not writing, how do you cope with the trauma?
According to us, according to general semantics, how do you move to the next level of abstraction?
Well, you can't just let it float there. You need to confront it somehow.
So if we say that language can have temperamental lingo, we can speak and it can have positive and negative connotations, and how we speak about it. So if we attribute danger to a traumatic event, we can be like the little old Italian lady who's re-experiencing it for the rest of her life. Or we could choose perhaps not to do that. What would that look like? I think Lance might be better equipped
No,
for this one.
but you said something that captured my attention in terms of you grieve, then you can't move forward, or as if grief itself is not important.
It sounds more like that subjective thing that we were talking about in trauma. So I don't know how we can possibly say you can't grieve, you can't write about it. What do you do next? It sounds.
I understand you to be posing a problem.
In language, the problem is language. If you have temperamental lingo, I'm grieving, I lost. I'm grieving. You're going to just re-excite and reignite and be 40 years dressed in black. So how are you going to change the temperamental lingo, the language, that you've taken the lowest level of abstraction, feeling of grief? Now you've turned it into a language of I feel so bad, and you're stuck with that. Can't you just maybe let that rise and fall and run its course and not attribute danger? If you don't attribute danger, why don't it just dissipate into...
Well, let's explore what you mean by run its course, right? What do you mean by if you let it run its course?
Right.
I'm interested in that.
Okay. How can I... time heals all wounds?
No, it's not true.
Well, maybe you didn't have enough time. She's had 40 years dressed in black. It's not enough time.
But
Let's just bring in not general semantics in this case, but symbolic interaction, which occurred to me earlier just when you say stigma, because that's a book by Irving Goffman. But I'm thinking of Hugh Duncan and his idea that emotion is different from feelings, that feelings are what go on inside us, but emotions are actions and acting out that we learn. And that's even when we say that somebody's acting out. So we learn how to act out grief. And not so much from Duncan, but you throw in an understanding of anthropology in different cultures act out grief in different ways. And this is very apparent. And it's something that is taught to us. So it's part of cultural learning. So to become aware of the part of our acting out, because that acting out can then, as I think we are talking about, is it feeds back and reactivates the feeling, and you go through it over and over again, which I think goes into the same idea as reliving the trauma by, that. But I think what they're really talking about is that the act of actually talking about it and separating yourself, being able to step outside of it, is what lets you get past that, because it also means being aware of your own kind of acting out of the emotion.
and your story, right? So that little old Italian lady that you're talking about, I grew up with a lot of them. She has a story that she tells
Right.
And it's sort of how she's built her identity about who she is.
It is her identity.
Right? That's very much something she doesn't want to give up.
Right, but Beth, in our terms, general semantic terms, the goal is clarity of thought and objectivity, and the method that we're using in general semantics should help us to do it within the level of abstracting and the methodology that we've been given, by indexing, however you want to. I disagree with that unless we write ourselves a memoir, there's no way out for us as general semantics. Right, okay, I'm just saying, we have a methodology that will give us objectivity on lower level abstractions, emotions, sensations.
I think that's what they're talking about really, is adopting an extensional orientation. That is the key to adopting an extensional orientation, is to, again, be able to talk about it, be able to step outside of it and look at it.
Oh, you're saying it's easier to do it with somebody else than to do it by yourself?
Well, whether you do it by yourself or with somebody else. I mean, Rogerian psychotherapy, for example, is all about being a mirror to someone else. I did some of that as an undergraduate. You just learned, you feel bad. You learned how, you're upset because your girlfriend yelled at you. We learned how to mirror that back, and that is actually kind of acting out in a way what you do with writing, when you write it down and then you look at it from the outside. But I think here, in general semantics terms, really talking about extensionalizing our feelings and what we're going through and our experiences, being able to look at it objectively by doing so.
And sharing. I would argue, yes, that it's a method is to externalize that with somebody, right? So including the emotion and the feelings that were not expressed around the story. That's not something that a lot of people are comfortable with. And I think that clouds our thinking. I think that, in the EMDR anyway, the theory is that when something traumatizes us, it affects our body, so much so that it's almost like we're frozen in that moment. And so we don't know that in subsequent moments that we're acting from that period back then.
The disconnected from objectivity.
Yes, right. So the idea would be that, in sharing that experience with somebody else, you can begin to sort of externalize through language with somebody else, or through just pure, sheer expression of emotion. It doesn't even have to be linguistic sometimes, right?
Break out the temperamental bedrock.
I think you can say, what is the experience? How am I mapping it? How else can I map it now? Now that I've looked at it as something I'm mapping, what other kinds of maps can I do? But since we only have a few minutes left, Doris,
I'm sort of concerned with the phrasing of things that express your experience and talk about it and then move on. I think there's a space that we're not for some kind of opportunity that we're ignoring. That everything that we do or have done to us changes our personality and how we are going to move on. I think forgetting about it is the wrong thing. I think that we should let this experience either help us in the future or hinder us, and we can talk about that. Not ignore the experience once you've had it. Talk about it, okay, that's past, let's move on. I don't think so. I think we should use that experience to help us to change our way of moving on.
So you agree with our panel.
Yes.
Yeah. You can never move on, right?
And we shouldn't.
Yeah.
We should learn.
Yeah, we can confront it, though, right? Ignoring it, like you said, it doesn't help it.
Well, I don't think only we can address it and talk about it and then people move on. I don't think so. I think when we move on, it has changed us.
Well, we had all mentioned the trauma as a scar, right? As a mental scar. So even if you weren't physically traumatized, the scars never leave, right?
But how do we move on? Not just have to
Well, that's,
worry about it.
when you look at it,
Yeah.
this is the metaphor, right? Move on is a kind of metaphor, so that it's like trauma happens and it's over, it's like a place, and now you can move somewhere else. But I think when you say the metaphor of the scar, that's a different metaphor, right? You are injured, you have a scar, you bear that scar for the rest of your life. That is,
It's how you deal
and
with
that's the better metaphor.
Right,
Right,
and the better
moving on.
metaphor would help you,
Yeah.
because then you can honor it, you can honor it as a bad, right? You can say
whatever
that's,
you want to do, you have to be taught or explain how you can move on with this background of experience, not just the
Yeah.
But I think it would start with by saying moving on is the wrong metaphor.
Right.
It's the wrong.
and
that's
even
bad language.
contextualizing some of what happens in trauma, people find ways to adapt, right? To when something happens to them, right? And so sometimes people don't realize that those were quite effective skills to get them through what they went through then, that then can also serve them in the present in different situations. Maybe sometimes it doesn't serve them, right? When does it? When doesn't it serve them? But again, it's saying, why not look at that, as something you emerge from that experience with, that you can utilize. It's a strength, right?
And we have to address that part, not just the
Yeah. Incorporate it into who you are now as you're evolving into this, as we're always evolving, as you point out,
in a
right?
good way.
Yeah. So how can I take that with me and take maybe what's maladaptive, what's not working and helping me function in the present, and then and use some of those strengths and skills that did help me in that experience.
So we can't, it doesn't happen again.
I think that's a great note to end the session on as we move on. And I would like to thank our panelists. This session has been both inspiring and in its own way healing. I'd like to thank you all for coming. At the moment, we're planning our next session for April 4th, and that will involve poetry reading. And so I hope you will all join us for that. And as long as you're registered and subscribed, for the NYSGS and through the website, you'll get notices about that.
You don't just name
We don't do we don't do. We just do email now.
Randy Vogon's going to be there giving poetry reading.
No Hogons, but Canadians. Make of that what you will. But thank you so much. Have a great night.
that.